In this episode, we're going to make data risk feel understandable and manageable by walking through how leaks and tampering can show up across the full AI lifecycle. When beginners hear data risk, they often picture a hacker stealing a database. But AI expands the ways data can be exposed or manipulated, sometimes without anyone noticing immediately. Data can leak through prompts, through outputs, through logs, through training artifacts, and through third-party services that handle information outside the organization's direct control. Data can also be tampered with in ways that change model behavior, producing harmful outcomes even if no one stole anything. The reason the life cycle view matters is that risk changes as data moves from collection to preparation to training to deployment, and controls that work in one stage may not be enough in another. The AI Security Manager, AAISM, mindset is to anticipate these risks early and manage them through consistent governance rather than reacting after harm occurs. By the end, you should be able to explain what data leakage and data tampering mean in AI contexts, where they tend to occur, and how high-level protections fit each stage of the life cycle. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful first step is defining what we mean by leakage and tampering in simple terms that map to real consequences. Data leakage is any situation where sensitive information becomes visible to someone who should not have it, whether that visibility is external, internal, or accidental. Leakage can be direct, like a file being shared publicly, or indirect, like a model output revealing private details that were embedded in training data or included in a prompt. Data tampering is any unauthorized or unintended change to data that alters what the system learns or how it behaves, such as inserting false records, modifying labels, or corrupting datasets. Tampering matters because the integrity of data is the foundation for trustworthy outcomes, and if integrity is compromised, the model can become unreliable or harmful. Beginners sometimes assume leaks are always external breaches and tampering is always malicious sabotage, but both can occur through mistakes, poor process, and unmanaged change. A key AI twist is that tampering can be subtle, like small shifts in data distribution, and leaks can be subtle, like outputs that reveal patterns rather than explicit secrets. When you understand these definitions, you can start to see why the life cycle is a useful frame for controlling risk. The life cycle begins with data collection and acquisition, and that stage is full of leak risk because it often involves gathering data from multiple sources under time pressure. Leak risk appears when teams collect more data than they need, which increases exposure and makes it harder to protect everything. It also appears when data is collected from sources that were not intended for this purpose, creating compliance risk and misunderstandings about what is allowed. Tampering risk appears when collection pipelines are weak, because attackers or errors can introduce incorrect or harmful data into the dataset before anyone checks it. For example, if you gather data from external feeds or user-submitted sources, you may be collecting content that contains misinformation or malicious inserts. Beginners should understand that the earliest controls are not technical wizardry, but disciplined governance, such as defining purpose, minimizing collection, documenting provenance, and setting access boundaries for raw data. Collection should also include integrity checks that detect unexpected changes or anomalies early, because it is easier to correct data before it flows downstream. If you think of the life cycle as a river, collection is the headwater, and polluted headwater contaminates everything downstream. Early controls reduce both leakage and tampering risk before the system's foundation is built on shaky data. After collection, data storage and handling becomes the next stage, and it is where classic confidentiality risk becomes more visible. Leak risk here includes unauthorized access, misconfigured permissions, and accidental sharing, but in AI programs it also includes the tendency to copy datasets into multiple places for convenience. Every copy multiplies exposure and creates new chances for mistakes. Tampering risk includes unauthorized modifications, accidental corruption, and inconsistent versions of the same dataset being used for different experiments. Beginners often assume storage is safe if it is internal, but internal storage can still be exposed through poor access control or overly broad sharing. A mature AI program treats storage not as a pile of files, but as an asset with classification, ownership, access review, and retention rules. Another important point is that storage includes intermediate artifacts like clean datasets, labeled datasets, and feature sets, which can carry the same sensitivity as the original data. If you protect only the raw dataset and ignore the derivatives, you leave a gap. This stage is where secure storage practices, access restriction, and integrity tracking support both confidentiality and trustworthy outcomes. Data preparation and labeling is the next stage, and it is where tampering risk often becomes both subtle and impactful. Preparation involves cleaning, filtering, transforming, and labeling data, and those steps introduce opportunities for mistakes or malicious influence. A small labeling error can teach the model the wrong pattern, and consistent errors can create biased or unreliable behavior that looks valid on the surface. Leakage risk also exists here because preparation often involves moving data into tools or environments that are easier to work with, and those environments may not have the same protections as the primary storage. Beginners should also understand that preparation decisions can accidentally reveal sensitive information, such as when analysts create sample sets for sharing and forget to remove identifiers. Another common risk is that preparation pipelines can be influenced by external code, scripts, or templates that introduce unintended transformations, which can be a form of integrity loss. High-level protections include controlling who can modify datasets, documenting transformations, reviewing labeling practices, and limiting where prepared data is shared. This is also a stage where quality checks matter because integrity is not only about preventing attackers, but also about preventing systematic mistakes. When preparation is governed, tampering becomes easier to detect and leakage becomes less likely. Training and tuning is the stage where data becomes learned behavior, which means the consequences of leakage and tampering can become harder to see and harder to undo. Leakage risk in training includes exposure of training datasets, but it also includes the risk that sensitive information is embedded into model behavior and could appear later in outputs. If the training data includes private details, the model may memorize or reproduce fragments under certain conditions, which creates an output leakage pathway. Tampering risk in training includes poisoning, meaning training on corrupted data that teaches harmful patterns, and it includes changes to training data or parameters that are not controlled and documented. Beginners should understand that training environments often require access to large datasets and significant compute resources, and those environments can become attractive targets for attackers. Training also involves many iterative experiments, which increases the risk of dataset copies and version confusion. High-level protections include strict access control for training environments, controlled dataset versions, documentation of training runs, and validation steps that look for unexpected behaviors. If training is treated as a controlled process rather than an informal experiment, both leakage and tampering become easier to prevent and detect. The core idea is that training turns data risk into system behavior risk. Testing and evaluation is the stage where you have a chance to detect the consequences of leakage and tampering before the system reaches real users. Leak detection and evaluation includes checking whether the model outputs sensitive information under common and edge case prompts, and checking whether it reveals patterns that should remain private. Tampering detection includes checking for unexpected changes in performance, unexpected bias patterns, or behavior that suggests the model learned harmful or incorrect associations. Beginners should understand that evaluation should not only measure accuracy, because a system can be accurate on average while still leaking sensitive information or behaving unfairly in specific contexts. Evaluation should also consider how the system behaves when users ask adversarial questions, because people will naturally test boundaries, sometimes maliciously. Another important point is that evaluation should be repeatable, meaning you can run tests again after changes to detect drift or new leakage pathways. High-level protections include defining unacceptable outputs, setting validation criteria, and capturing evidence of testing results and remediation actions. If evaluation is weak, you may deploy a system that looks impressive but is unsafe. Evaluation is where you discover whether controls are sufficient before exposure increases. Deployment introduces new leakage and tampering risks because the system becomes accessible to a broader set of users and is integrated into real workflows. Leak risk expands because more people can input data, more outputs can be shared, and the system may now connect to sensitive internal systems. For example, if an AI assistant can retrieve internal documents, an overly broad permission model can cause the assistant to reveal information to users who should not see it. Output leakage becomes a real operational threat because even a small chance of sensitive output can become significant at scale. Tampering risk also changes because attackers may try to manipulate inputs, exploit system integrations, or alter configurations to influence behavior. Beginners should understand that deployment is not just a technical release, it is a shift in threat landscape because exposure increases and misuse becomes more likely. High-level protections include strong access control, clear acceptable use guidance, logging and monitoring of usage patterns, and limits on what data sources the system can access. Deployment also requires clear change control so updates do not quietly expand data access or change behavior without review. A secure deployment treats data access boundaries as part of the system's core design, not as an afterthought. Operations and monitoring is where many leakage and tampering risks are detected, but it is also where risk can grow if monitoring is weak. Leak risk in operations includes users accidentally or intentionally causing sensitive output exposure, and it includes sensitive information being stored in logs, tickets, and transcripts without appropriate retention controls. Monitoring can also create its own leakage risk if monitoring data is broadly accessible, because logs can contain prompts and outputs that include sensitive content. Tampering risk in operations includes unauthorized changes to system configuration, changes to data sources, or changes to prompt templates that alter behavior. Beginners should understand that AI systems can drift over time, and drift can look like tampering even when it is caused by changing usage patterns or data distributions. Monitoring, therefore, needs to watch both security signals and behavior signals, such as unusual access patterns or output anomalies. High-level protections include limiting access to logs, enforcing retention rules, reviewing monitoring signals regularly, and having clear escalation paths when unsafe behavior is detected. Operations is also where incident response becomes real, because the organization needs a plan to contain leakage, investigate causes, and restore trust. Without operational discipline, a system that started safe can become unsafe quietly. A critical, often overlooked part of the life cycle is change management, because changes can create new leakage and tampering pathways even when the original system was well controlled. When teams add a new data source, expand user access, update a model version, or adjust prompt templates, they may unintentionally increase exposure or introduce integrity risks. Change management should therefore include reassessment triggers, validation tests, and updates to inventory and classification so governance stays accurate. Beginners sometimes assume that changes are improvements and therefore safe, but security often fails through well-intentioned changes that were not reviewed. Another subtle risk is vendor-driven change, where a vendor updates a model or service behavior, affecting outputs and data handling in ways the organization did not plan for. High-level protections include requiring approval for meaningful changes, documenting what changed and why, and rerunning key evaluation tests to detect new leakage patterns. Change control also supports evidence because it shows the organization maintained oversight rather than letting the system evolve unmanaged. When changes are controlled, tampering becomes harder and accidental leakage becomes less likely. Throughout the life cycle, one of the most powerful ways to reduce leak risk is to treat access boundaries as primary controls, because leaks often happen when too many people or systems can reach sensitive data. Access boundaries include who can view datasets, who can modify them, what environments can access them, and what the AI system is allowed to retrieve during operation. For prompts and outputs, access boundaries also include who can see logs and transcripts and where outputs can be stored. Beginners should understand that least privilege is not a slogan. It is a practical way to reduce exposure by limiting blast radius when mistakes occur. Access boundaries also support integrity because fewer writers and fewer pathways reduce the chance of unauthorized modification. Another key control is data minimization, Because the safest data is the data you never collected or never copied into a risky environment. Minimization reduces the chance of both leakage and tampering by reducing the amount of material that can be exposed or altered. These principles are not stage-specific. They apply across the life cycle, and they work because they reduce the number of ways risk can manifest. When access and minimization are taken seriously, many complex threats become manageable. Finally, it helps to recognize that leakage and tampering are not only technical problems, they are also governance problems, because human behavior and process discipline determine whether controls are used consistently. If employees do not know what data is sensitive, they will paste it into prompts and create leakage risk. If teams do not follow change control, they will introduce new data sources without updating inventory and classification, expanding compliance scope silently. If monitoring is not reviewed, unsafe outputs may continue unnoticed, and the organization loses the chance to contain harm early. Beginners should understand that good AI security programs therefore combine technical safeguards with clear policies, acceptable use guidance, training that sticks, and routine governance checks. Evidence also matters because proving you manage data risk requires showing what controls existed and how you verified them. This is why tasks about inventory, classification, impact assessments, and training are connected to data risk tasks, because they build the governance foundation that makes data protection consistent. When governance is strong, leakage and tampering are addressed systematically rather than through panic. As we wrap up, identifying data risks across the AI lifecycle means recognizing that leaks and tampering can occur at every stage, from collection to storage to preparation to training to deployment to operations and change management. Leakage includes direct exposure and subtle output-based exposure, and it can involve prompts, outputs, logs, and third-party services as much as it involves stored datasets. Tampering includes malicious poisoning and accidental integrity loss, and it can shape model behavior in ways that are hard to detect if documentation and validation are weak. A life cycle approach helps you apply the right high-level protections at the right stage, such as minimization and provenance at collection, access control and version discipline during storage and preparation, controlled training environments and validation during training, strong access boundaries and monitoring at deployment, and disciplined change control and periodic review during operations. The central beginner takeaway is that data risk is not a single event. It is a continuous management responsibility that depends on both technical safeguards and governance routines. When you can explain where leaks and tampering happen and why, you are ready to move into specific protections like access control, secure storage, integrity preservation, and retention control in the episodes that follow.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.